question from the people in the room before I dive into the list? What do you think? Anybody got a question they wanted to ask? Guess not. Dive into the list.
Yes, I do. I'm late. The question I have, I'm sorry, but this just occurred to me this morning. But the question is, what do you think about the idea of consciousness merely as a language and a dialogue? And with that, I pass.
Well, what is a language and what is a dialogue and what is consciousness? So there's not enough information in the question for me to respond to it. It is sort of, I don't know. I always think of consciousness more like a field, but that's just my imagination. What do I know? So, all right. Q asks, what are the 4 Ps Vervaeke always talks about? Peterson, Pageau, power, and PVK? Did I get that right? You got that right. Next question. Look at that, Joey. I burned through my first question in like a second. This is a new record. Just like my intro video that's 36 minutes long because, as Mark said, I don't know the meaning of the word intro. Maybe someone should ask me that. Okay. What do you think the mending of the schism of the church could look like? Many would have every other Christian heretic renounce their beliefs and join the one true church. Yet I have my suspicions that mending the schism of all the churches must look different in some manner. Thanks for doing these Q&As, Paul. This is a super hard question because, for example, what the Church of Rome, how the Church of Rome conceptualizes unity is sort of a visible social historical structure. I don't know a lot about the Orthodox. They don't seem to conceptualize unity quite that way. I do know Protestants don't at all, which sort of led to Luther's ideas of the invisible church, which is kind of funny, but you get what he's talking about, because then the church becomes this thing that's in God's mind more than we see running around out there in the world. I got to put my watch on, do not disturb, otherwise Freddie will call me a dozen times during the show. So I don't know. When you read, so I've been spending a lot of time in the book of Acts and thinking about the Apostle Paul, and a lot of questions about, what is the church? A lot of, so I've been listening to this great courses on, it's a thing on philosophy, and I really like the guy's take on philosophy. But so most ancient civilizations imagined that the pristine is the first and the foremost, and things decay from there. There's sort of reasons to conceptualize in that way. Modernity sort of reverses it and imagines progress. And I think that stands in many ways on a lot of Christian ideas about Jesus, what Jesus does to the Old Testament, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know in what way will the unity be manifest and instantiated? Will it be structural? Will it be everyone bows a knee and says Jesus is Lord? That's sort of Philippians 2. So it's a really good question. And a lot of movements like evangelicalism tries in some ways to unify the church, and a lot of different schemes try that. Even just the churches that don't like confessionalism will sometimes say, well, a Bible believing church, well, there's your little confession, isn't it? And these things sort of break down. So it's a really good question. And I don't know that I have a good answer. So I'll give you what I got, which is that. So John the Plunger. Hi, Paul. What do you think of the new perspective in Pauline studies and in the third quest and the historical Jesus studies? Not real up on it. You know, I've read some N.T. Wright on this. Basically, they locate Paul in much more of a historical context in Judaism. And then Nate Hale sends me an article on Twitter, which I only read about a third of, where basically David Bentley Hart continues his war with N.T. Wright. And there's some good points that David Bentley Hart made in that article. And Nate can drop the link into the feed. And that sort of gets into, you know, all of these questions of culture and time. We can't help but, in our attempt to sort of locate Jesus in history, we can't help but have to live with our reconstruction of Second Temple Judaism in history. And of course, our view of that time period is based on a tiny fraction of, let's say, what we have available to us in our apprehension of our own time period. So essentially, N.T. Wright locates Jesus within the story of Israel in many ways, kind of as understood by Paul, which of course sets Jacob's teeth on edge. And that's Jacob in the Discord server here, who is no friend of Paul of Tarsus. So I like listening to N.T. Wright. I learned from him, but I know you like N.T. Wright, but you also have some differences with him. Yeah, that's true. John's loving the Acts series. So I'm, you know, so part of what I'm planning on for my adult Sunday school class is a deep dive into the book of Romans. Now, my adult Sunday school class has been on ice during COVID, and Rick and I are going to take it off of ice. And I don't quite know what's going to happen with that class. I don't know how many people are going to come back into the room. You know, it's so funny because it's usually all the older folks, the ones who COVID usually kills off. They're like, I'm not afraid of that virus. They might wear a mask or something. So there'll be a few people in the room. I'm thinking of allowing. So I started estuary, and estuary has always obviously been something that we've talked about quite a bit, but I talked about Living Stones Online. That's been much more of a quiet project. I have let just a very few individuals sort of into Living Stones via the online space, partly because Living Stones is so small that if I just sort of open up the floodgates, the numbers at Living Stones will be dwarfed by online people. So what I usually do when people sort of ask for some kind of invite, I make it clear that if they're going to be part of Living Stones in a real way, they have to kind of commit. And what I mean by commit is not be here for a week or two and then leave, and also support the church financially. So that's some of the things that I've been doing. So I'll have Rick and I are looking at how Rick just brought his guitar into his little office there. He's going to strum while I talk. So part of what I'm going to do with the Sunday school class is have a Zoom room, and just a few people are going to have links to that, and they're going to be part of the conversation. And I don't know how long I'll be in the book of Romans. I was in Revelation for 75 weeks. And for those of you who know that a year is 52 weeks, about a year and a half, I was in the book of Revelation in adult Sunday school. So we'll be taking a long look at the book of Romans and these issues of N.T. Wright, because I've got a lot of his books on Romans. So I'll be reading him, and I'll be reading others. And so we'll see what I think of N.T. Wright. as the thing goes. And I know that via a lot of you, there's more awareness on my part of Orthodox teaching. I'll probably pick up an Orthodox study Bible and Logos that has my Bible study software. I'll probably pick up some Orthodox teachings and maybe some church fathers, pay a little bit more attention to church fathers in the book of Romans. So yeah, I'll keep monkeying around with all of this stuff, and what comes out of my mouth is usually sort of a mess, but hopefully it's helpful to people. So there's that answer. Pale King, Pale Prince. What's this dude staying out of the sun? Shalom, Paul. Shalom, Pale. You have mentioned Jacques Ellul quite a few times in various videos, specifically concerning his most popular book about propaganda. That's right over here. Haven't finished it yet. I barely got started. But I was wondering if you could touch more upon his anarchist views and how they might tie with your arguments and disagreements with Michael Malice. I don't really feel particularly expert in Jacques Ellul's anarchism or even Jacques Ellul per se. I've found some of his ideas very interesting. In fact, the intro to his little book, Propaganda, I thought was really masterfully done, because Ellul isn't always easy to understand. I read more carefully and really enjoyed The Politics of God and the Politics of Man, which is where he goes through some Israelite history with Elijah and Elisha and Joram and Jehu. This is a fun book. This is a fun book. And it's sometimes hard finding good Old Testament stuff. So I was listening to this philosophy course this morning, and he was talking about Adam Smith a little bit, which sort of marks the rise of emergent order, let's say. And the philosopher made the comment that people in antiquity would have found emergent order, that whole idea, to be just insane. Because, and you can see this in Plato's Republic to a degree, because Plato basically says, well, if you want to understand a good city or a good person, you have to maybe look at a city. In other words, the universe is sort of fractal. And the idea of emergent order, and of course this comes via Adam Smith and the idea about markets, is that all of these individuals may be acting for their own self-interest, creates an order, emerges out of it that is actually beneficial for all of these individuals that are acting in their own self-interest. And that idea is very antithetical to ancient ideas about the structure of the world. And in some ways, anarchists are perhaps a political, or in some cases a theological, a theoretical, or a philosophical expression of this idea that order can emerge out of chaos seemingly on its own. That throws in questions of final cause and divine agency, et cetera, et cetera. So at the same time, a lot of anarchists, like, how anarchist is Nathan Hale, really? Whoops. Heil, sorry. Nathan Hale, he's a different dude. How anarchist is Nate, really? I mean, he dresses himself, he manages to draw a paycheck from a job. I don't know. To me, an anarchist, I see a lot more people living a lot more lives of anarchy, and it's a pretty ugly thing. So there are even some Catholic libertarians who would say that St. Augustine was a closeted pseudo-anarchist through deeply analyzing the political context behind the writings in the City of God. Well, that's interesting. You know, the argument that this philosopher made was they're probably, you know, in some ways, Adam Smith was the first anarchist in terms of his belief in markets. So I don't know. I don't know. It's an interesting question, though. Nate's in the room. I don't know. He might be working. I don't know if he is one of our resident anarchist experts, has anything to say about that. But he's probably working, or he'll unmute his mic. I'll keep going. Hi, Paul. I'm wondering about ideas from your marriage equality video. Yeah, that video really took off. That was rather surprising. When I make a drawing of some object, there's the thought that my drawing should represent an ideal. Is that ideal in my head somewhere? Boy, this question of location of agency and thought and ideals is really interesting. I mean, traditionally it's in the heavens. I mean, a la Plato in some ways. I find if I draw this way, what comes out on the page is not an ideal object, but a very generalized object. Yeah, that's sort of the Plato-Aristotle debate. Do you derive your, you know, even the way that we derive things, you know, what do we derive in essence from all the particulars? And when you get into ideals, there certainly is sort of a social constructivism that happens. And I've lived long enough to watch, I mean, what is fashion, but in some ways crowdsourced ideals, or is it spirit sourced that in fact we're subject to spirits that are moving through us? And are these spirits themselves subject to things like evolution of spirit? You know, to get all Hegelian on us. Look at the real object, and drawing from life always makes a more interesting work. That's right. Do you see Jesus as the ideal man in this way? Well, part of the difficulty with Jesus is that, I know this is a radical thing to say, but Jesus was real as Rick, if not more so. See, Rick is very real. But one of the things that we note when you look at various forms of art is that a lot of our idealistic interpretations sometimes lack a reality that found things have. For example, who was I having this conversation with? I was talking about how this wasn't an online conversation. It wasn't a public conversation. I was having this conversation about how YouTube is really prone to just this reactive, dualistic straw manning. So you can ask Ben Shapiro how to create a big channel. Ask lots of high status YouTubers how to create really popular channels. Well, just keep reacting against an enemy. And so you straw man that enemy. But even straw men have innumerable individual, unique pieces of dry grass stuffed into their clothing. And so beneath the clothing of the straw man are the traces of this manifest individuality. And that's how you find people. And I liked the idea in this book on megachurches, where this is very Vervaakean too, where in some ways something that holds our interest has to both be close enough to our present knowledge so that we can frame it and apprehend it and locate it in our mappings, but just a little bit different enough to keep our interest and to give us that little bit of chaos and to sort of initiate the order chaos ordered chaos sequence that we love to keep working through to generate new ideas and novelty and all of those things. So part of the reason I both really enjoy and have a tiny little bit of anxiety about the randos tradition on my channel is that whenever you open up the microphone, you never quite know what's going to be on the other side. And part of what we do is we have learned to put on personas and represent ourselves and locate ourselves for the benefit of others and for ourselves. I wear a certain kind of shirt. I trim my beard to a certain degree. I manage my hair in a certain way. I speak with a language. My room is set in a certain tradition. All of this is this constant back and forth of this whole question of identity, of who am I and what am I, of communicating who I am to you and seeing myself through your eyes. And is this a bad thing? Just a constant feedback loop, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And we're doing this constantly. So one of the things that Rick is an expert in is networking. Rick knows a lot about computer networks. And last week he was sitting down and we were trying to figure out why we had a glitch in the last Friday live stream and why we had a glitch in the Livingstones worship stream on Sunday morning. And Rick was talking about the switch and TX and RX and all of this stuff. And that's how computers talk to each other. And the way computers talk to each other, even though for many of us that seems enormously complex, it is nowhere near as complex as what any two people are doing when they are having a conversation. There's so much going on between two people, most of which we are unaware of, most of which we are subject to and not masters of, that we're constantly, that's, I think, part of what was the power of one of the earlier ideas that got popular of Peterson's, of chaos and order. What's so powerful about that is we're constantly in that constant exchange with each other of chaos and order, chaos and order. That's what keeps conversations alive, but also keeps us from freaking out on each other and wanting to hurt each other or walk away from each other. We're just always doing this. And it's an unbelievably astounding thing. And we grow up and are able to do this. And we know this because we watch children begin to get a handle on these things. And it takes them a while to sort of figure out the mastery of this. My wife and I have been, one of my daughters moved out of the house and my other daughter isn't always around so much. So my wife and I are back to choosing our own TV programs, and my wife has to get up early in the morning to go to school. And so I get up early in the morning to be with her and before she goes to school. And so we've been watching a lot of Survivor lately because she doesn't want to watch anything at night that's too stimulating, but or not too violent. So we watch Survivor. The last few weeks we've been watching Survivor, and Survivor is a very interesting game show in that there's all of this human dynamics going on. And if human beings are the most complex things that we interact with in our secular world, it's fun watching Survivor because, of course, the people that go on Survivor have watched past seasons and they're always trying to evolve the game, but there's constraints within the game. And every now and then the producers add new things and they have these silly contests that they compete in. And the contests try to, make sure they're not all about strength or all about smarts or all about agility. Some they're about teamwork. So just watching Survivor and thinking about that a lot lately. There's just so much going on between us. And of course, sometimes in Survivor, you have old players and young players. And then, how savvy are 20-somethings with respect to all of these dynamics of human interaction, and how savvy are these older players as they interact with the younger players, on and on and on and on and on and on and on. So there's a ton going on, yet to what degree are these ideals? This is where we're going to sort of land into the Pageau Vervaeke ongoing conversation. To what degree are these ideals emanations from above or emergent from below? Part of where Peterson, so there is, Bishop Barron spilled the beans, gave us an early, didn't really give us a teaser, but now we know that there's a conversation out there with Bishop Barron, Vervaeke, Pageau, and Peterson. And so Pageau is clearly emanation from above. Vervaeke is clearly emergent order from below. Peterson is in the middle in some ways. He, speaking psychologically, working Darwinian evolution, basically articulates that via science, the scientific community as constituted in our imagination is all about emergent order from below. But Peterson sort of comes around the back and says, psychologically speaking, the only way we really conceptualize that, and the way over time in society we have most productively conceptualized that, is as emanation from above. And so Peterson makes, is an interesting partner in this little dance. And then, of course, everybody wants to know, well, is it really from below? And is it really from above? Because there are entailments and consequences for human beings with this. And in many ways, this entire question boils down to where many of our questions sort of get stuck in, which is there a plan to the universe that is preset, foreordained, a happy, good plan that will result in goodness and blessedness? Will our imagination, and we can sort of flip this around. Earlier I said ancients very much conceived of, and you see this in some ways, if not in the biblical text itself, in the interpretive tradition of the biblical text, that we begin by imagining a pristine, primal state of innocence and perfection from which we fall. And then what we try to do is get back to the archetypes, to get back to the beginning, to once again reconstitute our fallen, lost estate. Christianity does some funny things with that, because it says, basically, it gives a very optimistic answer of yes. And then through the evolution of Christian theology, it comes up with the answer that says, not only will we regain our lost estate, but the process of our losing original participation, we can use Barfieldian terms, not only of our losing the innocence of the garden, will result in a more developed walled garden, which is in fact a city, which descends from on high with a new heavens and a new earth, with a conquering army of Jesus Christ. So there's a lot going on with that with respect to ideals. And sort of where Peterson is fun is that Peterson is in some ways trying to have it both ways, and he is sort of flirting with us all by, well, do I believe in God? No, I don't think he's being, I don't think he's trolling us. I think he's being sincere because these things are difficult, and he always says that they're difficult. But there's a vital question in terms of our posture that we choose for living. Do we live as if the story is real and the story giver is good, and we sacrifice in the interim in anticipation of blessedness in the future in whatever way we conceptualize reward? Or do we look around at the universe and say, there's no order, there's no promise of good things to come. It's all on you, but what we know about you is even in some ways more sure of what we know of the universe. So you're going to die. Oh, but don't worry about that, even though you do worry about that. So round and round and round we go with these kinds of questions. And is Jesus an ideal man? Yes, but he was also a real man. And we have this record of his life, a very small record, relatively speaking. But it's not only, and of course the record that we have is from his followers and those who loved him and believed in him. And what we usually associate as a record in terms of biography, which is the Gospels, is really only part of more of the record, which of course comes from Paul, because Paul's record of Christ is a very different formulation than the record of the Gospels. So when Peterson comes out and says Jesus is the ideal man, following Jung, well, this is very interesting. And I asked the question in one of my marriage equality videos, if we would congregate, just imagine how to do that, all 8 billion human beings, could we find the ideal human being? Now, right away, you have a Vervaekean combinatorial explosive problem that I deal with what respect. Longest living? Well, that's a little easier to find who lives the longest. Tallest man, that's fairly easy to measure. Human height is something we can measure publicly and quote unquote objectively quite easily. But right away, we know that longest living and tallest isn't really getting at what we're trying to get at. And then you have the problem of essence, and questions of nominalism and all sorts of other things flow in. So Jesus as the ideal man, that's sort of what the Christian religion is about. That Jesus is not only the ideal man. When a religion takes a man and calls him God, that's about the definition of an ideal man. So, and that's part of the reason that I think if you break the Trinity, you lose something essential about Christianity, because there's a reason they see Jesus as divine. That's sort of the definition of an ideal man, because God is the category of which there can be no greater. So Jesus is the ideal man. All right. How do you strive for male, female for life ideal that's not generalized and smoothed out? Well, married, male, female for life. I mean, part of the reason I came at that, and part of the reason I called it an ideal, is just going through just a little imaginative experimentation that says, it's funny, at the end of the ContraPoints Envy video, there's a few little outtakes, and Natalie Wynn says, I can understand men marrying men. I can understand women marrying women. Why would men and women marry at all? And she has a point, because if your idea of what a good life is getting my way, why can't a woman be more like a man, from My Fair Lady? When I was in college, Calvin College had sex segregated dorms. So we had a male side and a female side. And I noticed dudes just always seem to get along better with dudes. They, they get sideways from each other. They might push each other around. You might get a fist fight, but at the end of that, it's men are simple. Over on the other side with the women, oh gosh, they are so complex. Now, maybe it's me because I can't see from them. And so, yeah, I can live with guys. Guys are easy. But viva la différence. Something about the other side that's chaos order. It's like opposite. It's, and so maybe it's just my heterosexual cake-baked brain, but I just don't see male, male, female, female as ideal in the way that male, female is in lots of levels. And again, for life, that's just it's just basically the definition of ideal for mortal human beings. And back when I was watching more Bachelor shows, I was just amazed at how, the vision of monogamy has taken a pretty severe beating in the last 50 years. And to find all these high status, ideal, in some ways, ideal for television, of course. The dudes have all been living in the gym forever, and the women, know how to dress. And some of them, I'm sure, have had plastic surgery, and they've all been socialized and been through. These are, by definition of the TV show, these are the best on offer in their generation. And they're all idealizing marriage. So then to read, I've got a couple of videos coming out next week of where the one video is going to really get into the marriage thing. And those of you who follow me on Twitter know that the New York Times has had had an interesting op-ed about, how divorce is just sort of the best self-love. And a lot of people look at that, and I kind of know what you're saying, but that's not the ideal. So how do you strive for that ideal? Well, usually badly. By definition, an ideal, you won't find the ideal human being in any 8 billion of us here and now. And part of that is the dilemma of the question, what is an ideal? And part of that is the definition of an ideal versus the actuality. In some ways, the ontological argument, which continues to fascinate me, is all about this question of what an ideal is. And it almost seems that human beings can't help but, at least the human beings we know in our limited perspective, can't help but play with these questions of ideal. We strive for them. We imagine that things could be a little better. Now, between my wife and myself, she is more of an idealist than I am. I tend to settle more quickly. Between Rick and I, when it comes to video productions and even my YouTube channel, Rick is more of an idealist than I am. I said, Rick, how'd you like my introduction video? Oh, I thought it was pretty good. And then, of course, Rick had ways that, could have been better. That's just how Rick is wired. And that's actually pretty helpful for me, because it helps me be a little bit more of an idealist than I am, which helps me improve my channel. So we strive for ideals that aren't generalized and smoothed out. And there's something that's also related to, again, this wonderful metaphor that I got from Peterson about resolution. JPEGs, if you play around with JPEGs at all, if you're building websites or even posting on social media or making PowerPoint slides, you very quickly realize that resolution is important, because if you grab a picture from the internet and it's very low resolution and you try to expand it and blow it up, you realize that there's just not as much information there. A higher resolution picture has more information and you can do more with it. What tends to happen, let's say in a long marriage, is that what you do is you just keep burrowing down in terms of resolution. And part of why committed human relationships are so complex is that the data set of the other person just keeps expanding. And because they're human beings, let's say after 33, my wife and I have been married for 33 years, the data set keeps expanding, partly because we both keep changing, partly because there's more complexity in each of us than our picture of the other can actually contain in the resolution. And we've got all these images in our minds fueled by propaganda, by commercials, by other people we meet, by stories we grow up with, by religion, by memories, by just about everything, that we're always comparing the actual from idealistic images that we are bombarded with. And now, we could say that when Adam wakes up and sees Eve, lucky Eve, she's not being compared to airbrushed and plastic surgery enhanced versions of herself. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She's a whole lot better than a sheep or a goat or an elephant. So, but now all of this idealization is always living with us and being bombarded with so much human culture. We're constantly in that process of, is this more ideal? Is that more ideal? And any choice that we make but is both a result of this process and the next contribution to this process. And this is constantly what we're living in the middle of. And so when one enters into a commitment, so I've told this story before. I was at Calvin Seminary. I was one of the very few unmarried seminarians, and I was dating the woman that's now my wife, and I hadn't made a commitment. We weren't engaged, anything like that. We're still just dating. And I did you have to do a psych eval when you go into seminary just to make sure that you're not a psychopath, and you take these tests where you read them and you'd think, who would answer these questions? I like to kill small animals. Who would say yes to that? Well, there are people out there, and they reveal themselves in these tests. And a colleague, I've told this story too, a colleague of mine decided he was going to have some fun. And so he answered a number of those questions in the affirmative and found that the psych eval with the counselor wasn't exactly the fun he thought he was having with the written portion of the test. So, are you really a psychopath? No, I swear I'm not a psychopath. I don't really like killing small animals. Anyway, I had my evaluation with the counselor, and the counselor basically said to me, you should probably make more commitments in your life. Stop riding the fence. And probably anybody who's watched my videos for any length of time, you've gotten probably a better than average picture of me in some ways. And you know that my high and openness kind of makes me a fence rider on a lot of things. And it probably keeps me a little bit interesting in terms of YouTube. But basically what the counselor was saying is you should make commitments. And Luce Meads at that point, he was teaching at Fuller Seminary in California. He came and gave some lectures at Calvin Sem. And he talked, I still have the little book from the lectures that he gave, and that he eventually developed that into another one of his more broadly published books about making and keeping commitments. That there's something about making and keeping commitments that is really foundational for realizing the development and glorification of the image of God in us. Well, why would that be? In some ways, when you make a commitment, you turn away from a whole bunch of possible ideals. It's a radical embrace of our limitations. And so when you do it, let's say, with a spouse, what the marriage ceremony is, taking this one and forsaking all others. Wow. And that's a big deal. And so now if we think about it in terms of all these crazy ideas we have now, our crazy conversations about things like potential and constraint, it's a radical embrace of constraint. And so if we think about emergent order, constraint is vital for the emergence of order out of chaos. And so how do you strive for this male, female for life ideal that's not generalized and smoothed out? It's through commitment, radical commitment. And of course, this is built into every story, every real story in the world. There's a location to Golgotha. There's a date of a crucifixion. There are veins and arteries severed by spikes. There are oxygen molecules passing in and out of lungs. What's the relationship between the ideal and the particular? In some ways, that's a big piece of the questions we're wrestling with. And that's, if you look at Pageau's conversation with Jordan Peterson, a lot of that conversation centers around that, because Peterson likes to sit and think about these ideal stories that have emerged from centuries or millennia of chaos that in some ways reveal the structure of the constraints in the reality we all share. And this is a tell, an indication, a revelation of reality. You don't get there without the particular. And so if you're going to participate in the ideal, you must embrace the particular. That might, in fact, be what's at the bottom of the ontological argument. Because the ontological argument says, conceive, there's an ideal, conceive of the greatest possible being. Well, now we're hung up on that. Is God being itself? Is God a being? To what degree is God non-being, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we get the idea. Now, such a being that exists has a quality which is superior to just the imagined being. And of course, lots of debate about the ontological argument. But I think a lot of this comes down to particularity. When Nero found and was presented with the young man who looked a lot like his favorite wife that he accidentally killed, I just meant to beat her up. I didn't mean to kill her. Oh, well, I understand now. I guess it's all okay, Emperor Nero. So when he's presented with the youth, and this youth is castrated, and then Nero marries the eunuch and really just flails around to find someone in Rome who can do something so that he can impregnate this eunuch so that the eunuch could bear children. Now, you just think about that. The procreative potential you have terminated in order to have this eunuch procreate on the other side. I mean, that story is just so full of chaos and order and archetypes. I remember going to a Rick Warren conference, and he said something to the degree of the particular has power. And he's exactly right. If I tell you just stories about how I imagine homelessness to be, but if I tell you based on a true story, a story about a homeless person and his life, suddenly it has more power for you. So it's a great question to think about, Eric. All this back and forth about ideals and particulars. Thanks for thinking with me. See, it wasn't the first question that I just... Go ahead.
Have you watched, not Vervaeke, Peterson, with his conversation with the Oxford and Cambridge scholars?
Yes.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
I was double check that.
Yeah, I was thinking of this morning, I was listening to it for a second time and thinking, as is often the case, there's more here than I thought was here the first time. So I might do more work with it. Obviously when Barron, Pageau, Vervaeke, and Peterson comes out, that's going to take a while. I thought it was a pretty good conversation. It's really, that conversation was June 2. So Peterson wasn't at his best. So there are ideal conversations we imagine in all our little brains that Jordan Peterson is going to have. And it's so funny the way these ideals work, because sometimes you listen to a conversation and you're disappointed because it didn't match your ideal. And then you listen to it 2 or 3 more times and you realize, no, it's in some ways better than the ideal that I had imagined for it. But there's always a fair amount of projection when it comes to our interactions with ideals. And it can't be any other way. So then the question is, can we have public ideals? Well, we certainly do. So it's this stuff doesn't end. All right. Richard's question. I believe that even in your first video, you brought up Neil Postman and the importance of platforms. I probably did. So here's the short version. Have you seen any significant change in the platform of YouTube in your 4 years on it? That's a really hard question because YouTube is so massive, and I've been interacting with it for just a short time. I mean, these are the kind of things I talk to Rick about, because Rick's been paying much closer attention to YouTube than I have. And so he knows stuff about YouTube that I don't. It's more easy to say what has surprised me about YouTube or what I've learned from YouTube. a lot of the metrics that we have and use with respect to this social network, which YouTube is a social network. Subs aren't quite what we think they are. Even videos aren't quite what we think they are. And there is so much diversity. So, I, like many of you, watch a fair amount of videos just of conversations. Well, that's weird. I started making my commentary videos before knowing anything about YouTube because I had seen and heard about Twitch and people watching other people play video games. So I saw Jordan Peterson and saw lots of people were watching him. And I thought, I wonder if someone would care to watch someone else watching Jordan Peterson. And I didn't know that that was already a thing. I just thought that's kind of a cool idea. Has it changed? Well, with my last videos about marriage equality, a number of you say things like, my comments are disappearing. Are you erasing them? No, not me. So that algorithm. And so this morning, Rationality Rules did another video about Peterson recently, and those are the videos that YouTube serves up to me. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll do some commenting on his video. I don't know. Maybe I will. But I am more and more aware of how the algorithm is playing with my salience landscape. And that makes me nervous. But then again, everything's always playing with it. So I don't know. I'm dependent upon a lot of you for recommendations. And so you're all playing with it too. That's all that colonizing. So I don't know. I think a great historian of this has been Matthew Patrick, a popular YouTuber who is mainly a video game and film theory crafter, but who has also been in the space of cultural commentary for many years at this point. His most recent meta theory of this place is here, link to it here, where he presents his thesis about how YouTube has grown past simply being a place for innovation and creative content into a place for serious business. The most interesting part of it for me is YouTube's contrast to TikTok. It's not uncommon now to hear someone like my uncle, a man in his 50s, say that he regularly watches YouTube. That's right. YouTube is YouTube the new Facebook? All us old folks are getting on it. Apart from this, the videos that fill the trending tab and top of the charts aren't tongue-in-cheek, low production skits, jokes, and viral videos, but are now half-hour to an hour productions requiring full-time staff and bureaucratic structures. That's fascinating. As I said in my intro video, I'm just kind of using YouTube as a learning platform and as a social network because I put stuff out there and y'all answer back. And I know that only a fraction of those who watch my videos actually respond, which is in and of itself interesting. So yeah, YouTube is evolving and we're evolving with it. It's sort of a very Matrix-like thing where humanity and the machine continue to co-evolve, but this has been going on for a long time. I mean, the whole question of if you buy human ideas of evolution, why do monkeys have such big guts and why do we value flat stomachs? Why, monkeys sit there and they chew on leaves and they need an enormous digestive system to just eke out the tiny little bit of nutrition that's in a leaf. We cook and we forage, and our diets are quite a bit more limited than many in the animal kingdom, and our bodies are different because of it, if you ask Brett and Heather. So, I caught their little part of sexual dimorphism. Why are men bigger and stronger than women? And Brett says, well, that perhaps isn't, he doesn't say perhaps, he's more dogmatic than that. That is an indication that males, Homo sapiens, have been competing for females. And I kind of could have told him that just by looking around, but I had never connected that with male size and strength. So YouTube's evolving too. I think that's right. All of this in the pursuit of ease of monetization. One of the things that you learn, and I learned after I monetized my channel, because I had, for a long time, my channel wasn't monetized, and then I was reading reports that YouTube was just going to start monetizing unmonetized videos. Maybe they never would have monetized any of mine. Mine aren't really a big deal as far as YouTube goes. They're pretty much small change. But so then I monetized, and it's very interesting. I mean, an average video of mine will gather $10 or $12 after. Most of my videos, their lifetime, they get the vast majority of their views the first day. And that says something about the way people are watching my videos and the number of videos I put out. I'm kind of a daily show, a daily program. And so most of you who watch them within a week of me posting them. Some of my videos have gone on a long time. I did a very early video on Jordan Peterson and institutional racism. And just because of the title, that's like I think that's now my second most popular video. And it was a very early video. I wasn't even making thumbnails then. It just continues to get views. Obviously, my conversation with Jordan Peterson is the highest video, but that institutional racism video I expect will pass it at some point. But most of my videos, I mean, there's not a lot of money to be made on YouTube from AdSense. Almost everyone understands that the real money to be made on YouTube is the fame that you can develop in the attention economy, and then through sponsorships, through all these ancillary things, even Patreon. That's not where the real money is. The real money is in being a shill for a corporation. That's where the real money is, or becoming famous for famous sake, like Kim Kardashian. But the number of people that get there is really small yet. So now my audio versions of, because it's just my audio, the audio aspect of my videos, that's about, on average videos, that's about a third of the, let's say, the consumption of the video. 2/3 is on YouTube, another third is audio only. And of course, when you go on YouTube, you won't notice that. But so then people ask me about it, because, well, what's going on with you? What have you managed to do? Because some people look at what I've done and they're very impressed by it. I don't think it's tremendously impressive. My channel is really very small. I came out not long after Pageau or Rebel Wisdom, and they're both far larger than I am. And that's okay. But this thing has continued to co-generate. And so then every now and then, like I do with my intro video, I take a step back and, well, what am I doing here? So I sort of self-transcend. And it's, for me, why do I still sit in this chair and look in this camera? It's not really about the money. Not that much money. One of the best things that has come about this is people who watch my videos help support the church. That's really nice, because I care a lot about this church. So it's not about the money. It's about the thought life for me. This has been, thinking together is far more satisfying than thinking alone. It's just more fun. And that's what's come out of this. That's really cool. So, and YouTube has facilitated that. Now, I don't know if I'll ever be on YouTube's front page. My videos are way too rambly. I mean, if I wanted to really get my point across, I should sit down and work real hard on a script and maybe do one video every month or so. But I wouldn't have as much to bring to that video as I have doing all this chitter chat back and forth and getting all these signals back from you. And I have to filter the signals, which is really a pain, because each individual, each one of you has more to share with me than I can take in. And again, this is part of the function which you learn in, let's say, a marriage. Even with two people who are astoundingly mapped territory with one another, there's always something new and surprising. And so with every single one of you, that's why we have these, that's why this Dunbar number makes sense, that I can only handle so many people. But if I still had 15 subscribers on YouTube, it would be easier, but it would be less than, because I also don't trigger the ideal stuff going. So I'm going to look at this video. The shift has been that my generation, the 18 to 17-year-olds, have gone to TikTok with its informal, short, funny clips. Sure, it's sort of the difference between a teenager getting a fake ID or maybe stealing some beer or booze out of their parents' stash, and the person who invests enormous time into cultivating their taste in wine. It's the difference between just listening to music that's coming around and truly becoming a connoisseur of music. Now, I'm not saying that to disparage young people. They simply haven't had the time. And again, a good culture, a healthy culture, is one that affords wisdom to the youth that they have not yet had the biological time to develop themselves. And so a lot of the kids on TikTok will probably grow up to have much deeper, broader, more significant thoughts. That's sort of the way life works. And again, I apply the ontological argument to this and arrive at an argument for the existence of eternity, human participation in eternity. Because if, I'm now in my late 50s, I'm at the point now where I have regular, I never went for checkups to the doctor when I was hardly ever saw the doctor in my 20s and 30s. And then 40s started, every few years. Then 50 in the United States. Okay, time for the colonoscopy. Congratulations. Happy 50th birthday. You got that to look forward to there, Rick. And then, your blood pressure's a little high. Oh, your cholesterol's a little high. Oh, your father dies at 77. Oh, your sister died at 53. Oh, let's watch that cholesterol. Let's watch that blood pressure. Better be a little bit more disciplined about your diet. Better be a little bit more disciplined about exercise, yada, yada, yada. So, and very quickly you learn that in some ways, I'm smarter than I've ever been. And I have a lot of you to thank for that. And I have YouTube to thank for that. In other ways, my cognitive ability is reaching an expiration date. Now, there's a lot of variability when it comes to human beings. You know, will I see cognitive decline in my 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s? I've known people that were sharp. My grandmother was sharp all the way up until the day she died. She had a terrific memory. My father got her memory. I don't think my memory compares to either my father's or my grandmother's, but maybe my memory is better than average. I don't know. I don't even know how you'd measure that. I'm sure somebody out there knows how. I have a little metric. But what I'm doing here on YouTube with all of you is in itself a thing that YouTube is constitutive of, that the Christian Reformed Church has been constitutive of, that my biology has been constitutive of, that Rick, that Living Stones, that Lenovo that makes the computer that's in front of me, Sony that makes the camera, this little light, the chair. This goes on and on and on and on and on. And so YouTube is just part of all that's going on. And, you know, in this little community, Jordan Peterson's been a big deal. Most people out there have no idea who Jordan Peterson is, and has he changed their life? I don't know. So, you know, that's the way this thing goes. So it's a great question, and I'm going to watch that video because these things change. And part of what's happening, part of, I think, why we have this sense of acceleration is, shoot, when I was a kid, it was TV and radio and magazines and newspapers and books and schools. You know, sometimes if my wife and I go out to a buffet restaurant, let's say, there'll be families of the father, the mother, and 2 kids all sitting there on the phone, shoveling food in their mouth from the buffet. And it's like, what's going on with that? So, yeah, YouTube's a big deal. And we don't know where this thing is going. And of course, you know, there's the politics of YouTube. So my videos are mirrored on Odyssey or Library. So no ads on those. And every now and then I go over there to look, okay, anybody watching these videos over here? Yeah, people are. We're along for the ride, babes. Prophet Zechariah, hard for me not to read Brett and Heather's new book and not think of the Benedictine option where the fourth frontier comes up. I haven't gotten that far in the book yet, but I can very much understand where you're going because, or what I imagine to hear you. Well, I'll keep reading. I'll shut up and keep reading. Seems like the IDW, to include Peterson, is like the Catholic Church. We call it the Liberal International Order. I think that's a typo. Contained within the Catholic Church are various orders and societies. The Weinsteins are like the monastics now. Eric is already there, apparently. Where is he? Good question. The new liberals and leftists are acting out their own reformation. Patterns, patterns, patterns. Many of these people a few years ago seemed aligned, and they're now disjointed. Oh, I love this comment. This is a great comment. Claire Learman is posting pictures of the beach in Australia and acting like it isn't a police state. I have Australian friends now who tell me about what's going on in Australia. Fascinating. James Lindsay is believed to have gone insane. Scott Adams believes that we are in a simulation. Does he? I haven't listened to him for a long time. Sam Harris refuses to speak to Heather and Brett as he believes they are harmful, like Alex Jones. I've been paying too much attention to Peterson and not enough to the rest of the homies. What do you make of all this? I find it fascinating. Me too. I'm so glad you wrote this. My salience hierarchy moves on too. And so, you know, I don't pay near as much attention to Heather and Brett, and I pay almost no attention to Sam Harris. I pay very little attention to Scott Adams, but now, so yeah, and part of why the Discord is good, and part of what I've been missing since I haven't been on in the last few months, is all the links you guys serve up. So I should really get back into that, because also how I use you is a filter. And I know that you use me in the same way, because we have little low resolution reputational thumbnails of each other in our heads. And so, you know, with some of you, even your little names on the Discord server, I know that you can point me to really interesting things and I should listen. So I really value this comment. And I think I like the analogy to the Benedictine option and the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Reformation. It's fascinating, but I think on the whole, I mean, my thesis has been, in some ways, the IDW are people with so much sunk cost in modernity that they're so panicked about the ways that postmodern wokers are ravaging the achievements of modernity. You know, I can't help but see similar things having played out in the church, with the modernist fundamentalist fights, with the Protestant Reformation, with almost any social change. Scott Adams believes we're in a simulation. So drop me some links about that. I read 1.5 of Scott's books after the Trump election, because Scott sort of fascinated me. Jordan Peterson fascinated me more, but Scott sort of fascinated me, and so I've kind of kept tabs on him. He's an interesting critter. Nate Heil, Jean-Luc Marion wrote that, thus grace constitutes the most proper depth of the will, interior intimo mio, as well. Nate, you're such a nerd. As well as its most intimate stranger. This would mesh well with Maximus the Confessor's distinguishing of the natural will from the gnomic will. I wonder what you think this idea. I don't know enough about it. So I should watch more of Nate's videos. I should watch more of Mark's videos. I'm a slave to this. I'm a slave to myself in some ways. And you guys need to make videos like Natalie Wynn. I want to see Mark up his game and, you know, lounge around, and come on, Mark. I want to see Nate do it too. Mark is so Spartan. He's got his desk. He's got the whiteboard behind him. His head is shaved. He's just telling you right there the way it is. What about Natalie Wynn's production values, huh, Mark? Luke would do it. I know you would, Luke.
I'm working on it, Paul. I'm making changes. Don't worry. It's better.
I love his Massachusetts accent. Don't worry. See Mark as contrapoints. Nate as contrapoints. Like I said, I can easier see Luke as contrapoints. Aritis, Philip Reif postulated that the commandments of sacred authority always come originally and primarily in the form of interdicts or prohibitions. Yeah, he's an interesting thinker. Thou shalt not. No comes before yes and is the origin of culture. And that's sort of the same idea as commitment, because commitment is obviously both yes and no. When you say yes to, let's say, a spouse, you say no to the other 8 billion people in the world. And so, which is bigger, the yes or the no? In keeping commitments, it's an interesting battle between yes and no. So what do you make of this idea? there's a lot to be said for it. It's a powerful idea. It's interesting, the 10 words, the 10 commandments. You shalt not, you shalt not. Saying no to ourselves. If you read some of these monkey brain books, one of the distinguishing features between human brains and chimpanzee brains is we have way more inhibition. And the reason chimps are so dangerous, those strong little creatures, are anger a chimp, they'll rip your face and your genitalia off. Human beings have managed to construct huge societies, even though we are the masters at genocide. We're much cleverer than chimps because we can say no to ourselves. And there was a book about conspiracy. I don't remember the author right off the head. He also likes Stoicism. He was on Eric Weinstein's podcast. It was a cool book. And watching Survivor has been fascinating with this too, because some people just can't say no to themselves. They find an immunity idol and they, it's like, don't tell anybody about that idol. You're going to have to keep that thing a secret, or something happens. They can't keep a secret and they destroy themselves in the game. And it's like, if you can only say no to yourself a little bit more, you would probably get ahead. Speaking as a guy who weighs 240, should probably weigh 210. If I'd only say no to myself a little better in a whole bunch of registers, wouldn't I be a better person? Probably. Most of you would probably never know my name because I probably wouldn't have made videos. So, oh gosh, we've got time today. This is the day I've been looking forward to. All right. It's 11:30. I've been working now for over a year to try to exhaust this queue with time to spare. And maybe it's a sign of the decline of my channel. Maybe I'm mapped territory. Maybe I've ignored or disgusted or offended enough of you to push you away, but we've got time to talk. I love it. Yeah. What do you want to talk about for 30 minutes? Y'all are in the Discord. Unmute and tell me.
Paul, you've just answered all of our questions. That's what it is. We have no more questions.
Yeah, is that a first? I think this is a historic moment.
This is the first time. It probably is a signal of decadence and decline. Here we are. We can end transmission and cut the PVK show now. We've jumped the shark.
Well, I do have a few thoughts. If we could circle back to Eric Mara's question.
Okay.
Because I've been thinking about the necessity for the abstract and the particular to come together in order to create meaning, right?
Yep.
So, and this is why, and Peterson would say this is why Christianity is so insistent that the resurrection is not only mythological and abstracted and the ideal story, but also manifested in history in a particular time and place. Now,
yep.
I was in a worldviews class in my school, which is essentially a world religions class. But in the first couple of weeks, we're going over, the common objections to Christian faith, and it's interesting to see what those objections are, because they're sort of lagging about a decade behind where this community is at, because we were talking about the creationism problem, and we watched like a documentary from the early 2000s that interviewed a intelligent design guy, a young earth creationist, and an evolutionary creationist. Just the standard, documentary on this sort of thing. And we were required to watch this video, and then all of the students had to give a response on a message board. And it was interesting to see the spread of how many students fell into which camp. I'd say it was about 60-40, 60 being evolutionary creationism and 40 being young earth. But what was giving me problems is that the objection to the position of younger creationism, that how if you believe in the historical manifestation of Christ, because that's an important part of its meaning, why do you reject the saying for the account of creation? And this has been swirling around in my head for a while, because when I heard Pageau talk about biblical cosmology, I started to think, wouldn't it be interesting if I acted as if I were a flat earther? Because I've noticed that when I pray now, if there's a window, I always look up at the sky. Because I recognize that in biblical cosmology, there's a deep connection to God being right there, to God being right above the earth, right? And there's a meaning in role playing as if you believe that. But of course, I don't believe it, right? So you see my predicament now.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you bridge these two?
That's in some ways, I mean, what you just sketched out there in some ways was why I sort of got hooked by Peterson, because it's that bridging, the acting as if, the and there's lots of one of the things that gets very little, it's implicit in what you just described. The biblical, obviously, or at least especially the Reformed, and part of what I know about Richard, because he's going to a Christian school in the same tradition in which I was raised. It's a school run and founded by the Christian Reformed church people. Right away, when in the 19th century, the whole imagination of a perfect world, I mean, the world was more ancient than at least Bishop Butler imagined. How can you hold these two stories together? And we via instantiation, we live as if we depend on them being together. And so I love how you said, you pray, you're looking up to the sky because that's where God is, but yet is he? Well, it just, we clearly have some struggles with conceptualization. And I think part of what we struggle with here is that we expect to be able to articulate an answer and to exercise the dilemma with an articulation. And I think even right there's a real problem. I don't know that it can be articulated with a YouTube video or a book or a wall of text. Because I think the answer to that dilemma.
Okay, see you later.
Susan, did you ask to be unmuted and then Rick unmuted you and then you're putting all this, you said goodbye in the channel? You got muted again. We'll let you back in a minute, Susan. I think the answer to your question is what you're doing more than what you can articulate. So your answer is when you're praying, you're looking up to the sky. That's the answer to your question. Now, you've got plenty of dissonance when you're doing it, but you're still doing it. And I think the tell of this is in, now obviously the New Testament has a conceptualization of a historical narrative a little bit different than just the Old alone. The New Testament is sort of an interpretive addition and guide to the Old Testament. And so the New Testament talks about final judgment. Well, let's call it evaluation, make it a little less scary for some of you. And it's all based on what we do. And at least in Protestant debates about this, or Christian debates about this, that then kind of throws us over onto the horns of saved by, grace through faith, not upon works, lest anyone should boast, from the book of Ephesians. And then everyone's being evaluated according to what they've done. Well, Protestants have been, especially Reformed Calvinists and their heretical cousins, the Arminians, have been debating this for a very long time. I think part of the answer is that there is always a limitation to our words. And I think this is even built into the idea of the logos. And that gets translated, of course, into English as Jesus is the Word of God. Well, the Bible is the Word of God. And then I find new atheists come and say, you said the Bible was the words of God. And said, no, that's not what I said. Well, and that gets off into a whole nother track. But I think you're right, though, Richard, that you're not going to solve this in class. I think the solution to the dilemma is acted out more than articulated. And that can kind of sound like a new agey dodge, I know. But I don't think it is, because you recognize this in human relationships. Again, back to Survivor. I've been watching a lot of Survivor lately. People listen to each other, and Survivor is all about lying to the people you're living with. That's what the show's about. You bring some people, you take everything away from them, you make them live. I mean, it's a devilish thing, the producers of these programs, to torture these poor people, dangle $1 million in front of them. And, I'm sure there's a huge number of people who want to get on the show, yada, 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 just to sign me up for I don't know what network they're on. Sign me up for television torture. The same with The Bachelor and all these other shows. People will willingly volunteer for torture if you give them enough status. But it's in Survivor, it's not what you tell me, it's what you do. And that's, even though stories are massive, powerful compression engines, doing is even more so, and deciding. And that's why, this other ongoing puzzle of humanity, which is will, agency, choice, is right there bound up in the same thing. What you do is in some ways more powerful than what you say, even though words are enormously powerful. And they're not really on the same plane. Doing and talking are on different planes, but reality is layered like that. So
Yeah.
anyway, Susan, are you ready to ask your question? Go ahead, unmute her, Rick.
I apologize. My screen was black and I didn't realize that I was broadcasting, so I really apologize. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, anyway.
What's your question?
I'm not going to take up more time with the apology. I'm going to ask my question, okay?
Good.
I don't know if I'm the only one, but I'm the person who's been trying to find out why my comments have been deleted from underneath your YouTubes. And I'm beginning to suspect that it isn't the algorithm acting, because the book that I was referencing has had its time when it was dropped out of Amazon. And I don't know how efficient the internet is, but it may, I don't know, maybe primed to basically smother that book, which is a little scary to think that it can chase the book all the way around the internet into sites that have nothing to do with it, but there you go. So I'm going to ask my question, and it more or less goes like this. My question is, how damned am I? And I mean that in the classic sense of the word, as opposed to the vernacular. And here's this is a genuine question. I'm going to start with the book. The book, I'm going to give a thumbnail sketch of it, was written by two women, and what it discusses is the difference in outcome for children who are raised in intact, married, biological families versus what happens to children when they are raised in any other kind of family. And not only same-sex families, but, and this was really quite shocking to me, children that are born from artificial insemination if the donor is not the husband, but rather somebody else, or even rented wombs, or all these birth technologies. And what they have managed to do is to find that children who are born in those circumstances, when they find out what their origin is, actually do suffer some very severe repercussions, including depression and other things, because now they don't have that sense of who am I? They have something inside of them that wants to find out who they are. And the children who are raised in same-sex families have a sense of not knowing what the other sex is all about. Now, here's where the rubber hits the road, sort of, with me, is that I have been looking at various Christian sites, those that are run by, which might call the manosphere, in which they'll tell me chapter and verse why, unless I am living in a way subordinate to my husband, and in which I'm taking direction from him, and he's the one who decides what I can read and what I can do. And if I have any questions about church, I should be asking him for the answers, not the minister, because that's not my place to be doing that kind of stuff. And here's the thing, is with the way that men have been pounded down lately, I truly understand why men are perhaps, I don't know whether they're going forward or retreating to positions like that. But the thing that hits me is they seem to be quoting biblical sources for it. And here's my dilemma, is that I would have been willing to bet everything that the issue of same-sex marriage or technological parenthood using these very weird technologies was qualitatively different from women, say, in the ministry, or women having careers, or women having a different kind of relationship with their husbands, even if it's different from what might have been regarded as a traditional way before. But I'm not that conversant with the Bible. This is why I come here. And so I'm asking you, is there a qualitative difference between those two arguments, or is the fact that women have entered into these spheres, begun the slippery slope down to a irredeemable path?
If you do a little digging even into, let's say, adoption, a lot of the psychological work on adoption has been fascinating in terms of children of adoption. The former Ron Needham, the former professor of pastoral care at Calvin Seminary, did a lot of work on this area of adoption and was, advising mothers to, when they would first receive the newborn, hopefully as young as possible, to spend a lot of time, even if they couldn't nurse the child, to just skin to skin with the baby. We are so subtle and so deep that it shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us that there are ideals, and the further you get from an ideal, the funkier some of the statistics will get on lots of things. So here are two true things about human beings. There are ideals, and there are ideals, the consequence of which, if the ideal is not at least approximated to a great degree, can be severe. And human beings are enormously resilient and can survive all kinds of things that are very far from the ideal. Both of those things are true. And the fact that, it's so funny that in the woke crowd, the word fragility got thrown around, when I find that there's tremendous amount of fragility in wokeness itself. All these things we can't talk about. You would think it would be of most interest to, let's say, non-traditional couples who are bringing children into the world, employing technology or even and other ways, and creating families out of these things, that they would be the people most motivated to look with the least biased eye at performance and aspects of what is required for their children. But, the idea that, I'm not at all surprised that exploration into the social science behind these questions is suppressed by corporations that, for their own progressive religious reasons, want to look like they're on the right side of history. So all of that. Also, your comments about the manosphere and Christian sites. I'm old enough to have seen churches prevent women from doing things that they had done for generations, and nobody thought a darn thing of it until the church had to face the contemporary women's liberation front, and then suddenly churches got reactive and said, you can't be a Sunday school teacher for 13-year-old boys if you're a woman. And it's like, that's kind of crazy, isn't it? So I think you're right on that, in terms of a lot of we didn't have complementarian until we had egalitarian. And part of where I learned this was being a missionary in the Dominican Republic, where through one set of eyes, they were as patriarchal as you could imagine, because a woman would be in trouble for going to church if she were wearing pants, and a man could be in trouble if he were wearing shorts. And I remember one missionary trying to make a point to some of his pastors, brought a pair of his wife's pants to a pastor training session, held them up and said, "Would any of you wear these?" Now, of course, a few decades later, the questions get even crazier. But there's a real problem that's happened once you introduce one thing, you almost always call up its opposite. And we've seen a lot of that in the debate over women in ministry and women in church. And now, the articulation of a family and what a family should be like. So I think we need to talk about these things. And I was very much raised. So my first draft from my parents, my mother, was an elder in my church at some point, and I didn't find women preaching or leading churches a particularly heinous thing. The more I learned about this and the more I thought about the difference between what a church is in the Protestant sphere and what a worship service is in the Protestant sphere, as opposed to Orthodox and Roman Catholic. And I mean, there's lots and lots of layers and differences here. And there's a world of really interesting things to explore and to look at. And I'm often frustrated that we can't seem to have a productive conversation and an interesting conversation about these things, because quite understandably, people get upset quickly and get defensive and want to win a battle. So I don't know. I'm not surprised that if you put a book into, when Rick and I stream our church services, if you ever listen to any of the Living Stones church services, we do as good as we can with music. We're not, nobody's really gonna come to this church for the music, but YouTube is always flagging our songs during the worship service for copyrights. And Rick and I just sort of laugh about it because I'm surprised the computer's that smart. So no, things are really connected. And to drop a link for a book that, let's say, Amazon has decided it doesn't want to have YouTube, to have the algorithm and these AI machines so smart that it won't let you put ideas in. Yeah, that's where this is going. And I'm not at all surprised, but I guess what I want for my channel is a place where I haven't done much talking about women in church office in Protestant churches. And as with many things about me, when I talk about my thoughts of this, even though people's low resolution picture of me in the Christian Reformed Church was, oh, Paul is a good guy because Paul has women preaching at Living Stones. I've trained women for ministry. My reputation was a big supporter of women in ministry in the Christian Reformed Church. So it's one side lines up and says Paul's a good guy. But then when Paul says, I continue to think about this issue and I have more thoughts, and they're like, no, you landed on the correct position. Have no more thoughts. And it's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I am going to have more thoughts. And I've had colleagues that have flipped on these issues multiple times. And I think that's the sign of someone paying attention and doing some thinking. Now, that's really hard to do as an extended organization where there are policies and rules. So I wish that there were more. I'd love to read a book about what book don't I love to read? I'm curious about differences from children from intact biological families and other families. That doesn't surprise me at all, nor should it surprise any of us once you appreciate the fact that there are far more layers to human beings than the ones that are obsessing our current political climate. And to go back to my answer to Richard's point, every time we act, every time we choose, in fact, every time we commit, it's when two people decide to marry Or when two people decide to get in bed together and, have some fun with each other's genitals, we're playing with stuff that we barely know the consequences of. I was reading a thing. I think it was in the New York Times. Someone was just really, it was someone talking about the fact that she hooked up with this dude, and she was the kind of woman that gets a chance to write articles in the New York Times, and he was a blue collar guy, and she was just like, I want a good time in bed, and he's like, me too. And so they had a good time in bed, and they had it more than once. But then she'd get involved with men who were more like she was looking for, and and then she'd even get married, but she'd keep stepping out, and she's had an on and off affair with this guy for 12 years, and she's kind of surprised by it. And it's like, we've had 100 years of talking about psychology and sexuality, and you're at the upper ranges of well-educated, articulate, high IQ people in our culture, and you can't figure out why you've had an on and off relationship with this blue collar guy for 12 years. Well, on one hand, I agree that, just like I said to Richard, you will probably never have enough time in your life to fully articulate all of the dynamics that go into that one act. That's true. But even someone who knows a little bit of psychology with a low resolution picture can say, yeah, I can see why that's going on. Well, I'm not, and the person's like, well, I'm not necessarily comfortable by the fact that, even though I'm trying to stay married, and it kind of messed up a couple of marriages because, I kept hooking up with this guy, and, how can I explain this to my spouse? Yada, yada, yada. How dumb are you? I mean, people, before they had any knowledge of psychology, knew this. What led you to believe you could just do things in this world without consequence? I think that is something that our culture has to answer to God to when it comes to raising up our youth. Because, okay, there's contraception. You may not get pregnant, but do we really understand the consequences of all of the things that we're doing? Now, for the critical race people, on one hand, I can appreciate the fact that there are consequences to racism and histories of racism and bias and discrimination against African Americans, against gays, against women. There are consequences to that get into structures that reverberate through people's lives in destructive ways. No argument. Absolutely agree that they are manifest. That you think you can tinker and somehow sidestep them with these projects and programs? So many of the negative side effects that you're pointing out in our structures have all been the consequences of attempts to remedy past things. Human agency is an unbelievable thing. So, yeah. I'd love to hear you talk about what a great... Rick, did you put the live feed up? What did you put that up on? Oh boy, Rick, I can't look at that when I talk because I'm way too ADHD. You can leave it up. I'll just not look at it. We're out of time anyway. So I don't know. Susan, did I answer your question in any helpful way?
Well, at least you didn't answer in the affirmative that I was damned. So I'm pretty happy.
I'm not God. I can't answer that question.
I know I'm kind of joking here a little bit. So Canadians have sense of humor, but I really do strongly recommend that book because
What's the title?
Boy, it's called now it's flipped on. It's in your it's in your Substack thing. Them Before Us.
Oh, okay.
K.T.
Okay.
Fox. Okay, but truly deep dive into what, all of these things that I thought were kind of okay. So there you go. And thank you very much for your answer. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, Susan. Good talking to you again. All right. We're out of time unless someone just is in there and boy, I had to get into that chat room because I had to ask this question. This is your chance. Nope. Nobody there for that. Just looking through the icons. It's kind of fun. I see all these really wonderful people on the Discord server. Some people I haven't talked to for a while. Anyway, good to talk to you all. I guess we can end transmission, and maybe when we stop live streaming this, that's usually when everybody gets talkative again. So go ahead, Rick. You can end transmission.